Good morning, everybody, and many thanks for the invitation to be here. I was delighted to accept it. So this morning I've been asked to speak a little bit about agriculture and the shape of agriculture, and then I'll move on to, I suppose, what we know about the biodiversity supported by agriculture. So moving on pretty quickly through it, we have about 135,000 farms in the country. So it accounts for a very high proportion of our land use here in Ireland. About 68% of our land cover is under agricultural production, and the vast majority of that is under grassland of one form or another, with a small amount of cereals, about 6% cereals in there. And as a consequence, we're very ruminant based, so we have a lot of cattle and a lot of sheep in the country because we grow grass very well, and that's what we need to feed those. If we look at the sector overall in terms of its value, in terms of employment, total employment within it is just over about 7%. It accounts for about 9% of exports in terms of value terms, and about 38% of total indigenous exports. So it's hugely important. And as I said, the main emphasis is on cattle and sheep, and the three systems, the main systems within kind of Irish farming would be beef, dairy and sheep. Where those systems arise in the country is largely dictated by soil quality, but also if we look to the map on your left there, you can see this is the drainage map of Ireland, so we can see how well drained the soil is. And you can see that in the south and southeast of the country, the lands tend to be better drained than when we go west. And that influences the type of systems that develop in those areas. On your right then, you can see the rainfall map of Ireland. And again, you can see that as we move further east, we get drier conditions. So that will influence what type of farming happens in those areas, what can happen, and then what results from that. So very briefly, just an overview of our dairy farming, primarily because of the reasons I've just mentioned, located in the south and southeast of the country. And the 5 counties that you see there in the deep red would be the primary counties for dairying. That's not to say it doesn't happen elsewhere, but it is hugely important in those areas. It tends to have a larger farm size, so our average national farm size would be about 32 hectares, 33 hectares. Average farm size on dairy farms is larger at about 65 hectares. If we think about our beef farming then and where that's located, very much centred around the border Midlands and Western counties, with those areas accounting for about 60% of our beef farms in the country. And they tend to have smaller farm sizes. About 27 hectares would be average farm size there. And then in sheep, again, even more marginal land, if you like, land that is wetter, that is more improperly drained, drainage impeded rather, and we certainly in our upland areas, so along the west coast particularly, and in mountain ranges would be where our sheep production happens. Of course, 135,000 farmers, and these different systems, that gives rise to 135,000 different ways of doing things. And farmers have been farming this part of the world for about 6,000 years. So those farmers have had an enormous influence. Much of the biodiversity we have has evolved together with traditional farming practices, but also there are some farming practices that have had, I suppose, more negative impacts on biodiversity. And just to illustrate that, the first image up here would show the more intensive end of the spectrum, but we've got an awful lot of different land types that happen and occur within the Irish landscape, the Irish farm landscape, in addition to that. So there's an awful lot of different forms of agriculture and different practices, and that gives rise to different habitat types and different intensities of land use. And, you know, we see on the top, I guess, the very intensive example first, and then what would represent an awful lot of our permanent grassland types in the middle, then wet grassland on the right, and beneath that, the more semi-natural grassland habitat types, for example, our calcareous species-rich grasslands. The middle image is from the Callows beside Clonmacnoise, and then the coral fungus on the bottom right there represents our acid grasslands. Of course, financially, things vary as well depending on the system that you're operating within. So on average, and this data is drawn from the Teagasc National Farm Survey, our dairy farmers on average have, in 2020 had an average family farm income of about 74,000. However, when you look at our dry stock enterprises, so those farms involved in beef production, sheep production, their income is much, much lower. If we look at the amount of the value of the direct payments or the payments that farmers receive through the Common Agricultural Policy as a proportion of their family farm income, we can see just how heavily dependent these dry stock farmers, so the cattle rearing, cattle other and sheep farmers, are on those payments. In fact, they're using up part of their direct payment to make up the shortfall from their agricultural production costs. So there are huge challenges there in terms of agricultural viability, I guess. Now that's on average, and farmers make it work because most people, a spouse, a partner would have enough farm job as well. I suppose the growing realisation is that biodiversity isn't just something that's nice to have. It is nice to have it, and there is a moral argument for it, of course, but there is, I suppose, a more human-centric argument for it, that it provides us with a range of ecosystem services that fundamentally underpins the sustainability of our agricultural production systems. And those are summarised very nicely under the 4 headings defined by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as provisioning, and we generally associate, I suppose, or traditionally, we would think about the food production ecosystem service of agriculture, but we also have all these other ones, like soil formation and photosynthesis, etc. So we need our landscapes to be able to deliver food, because we need food 3 times a day. That's a hugely important ecosystem service. But we also need them to be able to deliver all these other ecosystem services as well. And the way we produce our food will impact on the ability of that landscape to deliver those wider ecosystem services. Similarly, those wider ecosystem services are going to influence how we can produce our food and how sustainably we can produce our food. If we take the soil as an example, just a brief look at it, soil, is the substratum on which we build everything, and we are completely dependent on healthy soils for for food production and ultimately for our own continued existence. We know that biodiversity is a hugely important component of our soils. We talk about living soils. And this just illustrates the kind of numbers of organisms that we would expect to see within healthy soils. But we know very little about those soils. We know very little about the diversity that's in them and how that's changing, how it changes under different systems. But we do appreciate that we need this range of organisms, and if we have them, we have a better likelihood of being able to provide those very fundamental services like nutrient cycling and carbon sequestration, like the regulation of pests, etc. And that all needs to happen at field scale, as well as at farm scale and landscape scale. I couldn't let the opportunity go without putting one slide on multi-species swords, and these are swords that haven't been designed necessarily for biodiversity conservation, but I put it in here as an illustration, I suppose, of what happens when we even include a little more diversity within those very species-poor sward types or grasslands, and those very species-poor ones, or the ryegrass monocultures, are hugely dependent on fertiliser nitrogen to keep their productivity up. And of course, that has implications economically and environmentally. So if we include a small range of additional species within those swards, and absolutely legumes need to be in there, but also forage herbs as well, the research to date has shown that we can reduce our fertiliser nitrogen inputs. We can grow as much herbage with 40% of the fertiliser as we're putting on the ryegrass. So we can increase, in some instances, grassland herbage production. We've been able to increase animal performance and accelerate date slaughter. So we're seeing about a month of a difference in animals that are reared either on more diverse swards versus the monocultures. Sheep and lambs that have been grazed on multi-species swards have required half the use of anthelmintics, which becomes increasingly important when we see the levels of resistance that are building up to those products that are currently on the market. We have some indications, aside from the biodiversity we're building into the sward, but that these swards will also support additional biodiversity, invertebrate biodiversity, and we're about to start more work on that to find out more about that. We know that they reduce the carbon footprint of the farm because we're reducing the amount of fertiliser. We're also reducing the length the animal is around. And the latter stages of an animal's life are when they produce most methane. And overall, they enhance resilience of the system. So even a small amount of additional biodiversity into those grasslands can be hugely important and deliver for farmers. If we take the kind of what I refer to as the farm infrastructural habitats, like the hedgerows, for example, we know they're hugely important in terms of providing services like animal shelter, for example. But carbon sequestration is another issue, and carbon storage. We know they take in carbon, they store that carbon. We know they emit some CO2 in terms of respiration, etc. What's the balance? We think what's going in is larger than what's going out, or we know it is, but we don't have a huge amount of insight into that yet, aside from a little work that's been done in the UK, which would suggest that the carbon store in those hedges could be as much as about 35 tonnes above and below ground per hectare. Again, in terms of sequestration rates, we know that they're sequestering, but limited information on that yet, although there is work ongoing and will be in Teagasc. Okay, I'm going to rapidly move on to some of the farmland habitat surveys that we've been working on, and just to give an illustration of what's actually on our farmland out there, aside from, I suppose I'm not really focusing on the designated habitats here, it's more about common farmland habitat types. So the kind of work I've been involved in mapping those habitats would indicate about, on average, 13% of farmland area under those semi-natural habitats. That compares very favourably with some other countries, although it must be said some of that data is quite old. It's hard to get farm-scale data, and also it's mainly arable systems there. While we've retained a lot, the quality of that habitat is often questionable. We need to work on that very significantly. If we look here at our hedgerows, for example, at least half of them are not in good ecological condition. If we take that work then, and then, we were working in different regions of the country, Cork, Offaly and Sligo Leitrim, and map that against farm system, we can see very clearly that, an average of 13% is one thing, but it masks a lot of the detail. We see that we have more retained in those areas that are less intensively farmed, and that's as you would expect. When we take the farm scale data and bring that up to more landscape data, it even becomes more pronounced. So the message out of that from me would be that yes, we need food production, and areas like Cork, for example, I'm not picking on it, but one example of it, are very good at that. We can't make it all semi-natural again, but we need to retain the habitats that are still there and make sure that those are in the best possible condition. We need to support the farmers that are in the more financially challenged areas as well, to continue retaining the biodiversity on those farms. And certainly if you look at the predicted distribution of high nature value farmland in the country, the greener areas are where you would expect to find more high nature value farmland. And certainly that ties in with what I've just said, you know, that as we move into the West and Northwest and North Midlands, we're seeing a higher likelihood of that kind of habitat being present. So in terms of my take-home messages, agriculture encompasses an awful lot of things. There's a range of practices and a range of systems in there that should be recognised. We've retained a lot of semi-natural habitat on our farmland, but the quality of that is questionable. We need to focus on retention of it, enhancement of it, and also ensuring that the measures we put in place are at the right scale. We need, I believe, greater emphasis on the positive contributions that biodiversity can make to people, to the delivery of ecosystem services. Appropriately recognise and reward farmers who are protecting and enhancing and maintaining biodiversity, particularly those who are in financially very vulnerable situations. And then lastly, as more of a word of warning, if we're dealing with these issues, we need to see them through multiple lenses. Focusing on greenhouse gas emissions alone, which is something that's getting a lot of attention recently, could potentially lead us down a route of exacerbating other problems like biodiversity. So we just need to be careful about how we address one problem and make sure it doesn't exacerbate another one. Okay, thank you.